Okay, good morning. We're going to go with a lecture about the last half of chapter 11 in your textbook. And those of you who do well with lectures, hopefully this will help. Pretty important section in American history we're at right now about slavery. As you know, the conditions down south were perfect for plantations, long growing season, lots of good farmland. So slavery took root down south. Not anywhere else, really. There was some slavery in the other colonies, but it eventually died off. And ultimately, down south is where the Africans were shipped from Africa. There was a tradition down south called primogeniture, where the father who owned the plantation, when he died, he would leave the entire plantation to his eldest son. And the problem with that was that the younger sons, they got money, but they didn't have any land, and so they had to go out and buy land to make their own plantations. And so primogeniture actually increased the demand for slavery, and it caused the spread of slavery, which of course hurt the Native Americans because down south they took the Native American land to create the plantations. So primogeniture was when the eldest son got the entire plantation. Slavery was actually sort of dying off because it was really bad. It was a slow process to get the cotton. You had to pick the cotton, then you had to pick all the seeds out of the cotton, and it took hours and hours and hours to do that. Well, in the 1790s, a New Englander by the name of Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which allowed for the rapid processing of cotton. It removed the seeds automatically. You put the cotton in the machine and turned it, and it brought it out, the pure cotton. So it increased the demand for cotton, which increased plantations, which increased the demand for slaves. So it saved slavery, and it caused slavery to grow all across the South. All right, so the problem the United States faced was that slavery was against everything that we actually stood for, and a lot of people realized that. And a group of mostly New Englanders, but other Northerners, called abolitionists. What are they called? I didn't hear you. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm on YouTube. Abolitionists, they were people who believed that slavery should be eliminated immediately, not gradually, but immediately. And so by about the 1820s, they began to become a vocal group that opposed slavery. A lot of people thought they were religious fanatics, and because most people up north didn't care about slavery one way or the other. Now, politically, the problem was now, after about 1820, when new states were created out of the territories, they were either free states or slave states. And as a result, there was this argument as to allowing new states in. You had to come in pairs. So like Arkansas, a slave state, came in with Michigan, which was a free state. Missouri came in as a slave state. Maine came in as a free state, and so forth. Well, in 1831, a slave named Nat Turner, who was a Christian minister as well, who would visit plantations and preach to the slaves and so forth, he organized the slave uprising. He felt that God had called him to have the slave uprising. So what he did was he organized in August of 1831, he launched a rebellion. He had a band of slaves with a few free black slaves as well. And they roamed the countryside and they killed slave holders and their families, women and children and everything. And it was bloody, very, very bloody in the state of Virginia. Well, he was eventually killed, and many of the slaves were killed as well, executed. But what it did was it scared Southerners. So they made the slave laws, slave codes even harsher as a result of that. The abolitionists viewed Nat Turner as a martyr for the cause of anti-slavery, but Southerners viewed him as a murderer. And they feared the African Americans. Remember, there were millions of African American slaves, and so white Southerners were afraid to go to bed at night sometimes because they were surrounded by these slaves, and they weren't sure whether the slaves were going to try to kill them at some point in time. Fortunately, most slaves were very good people, and they were peaceful, so that never really happened. Um, Another important person who was an abolitionist was a man named Frederick Douglass. What was his name? Okay, Frederick Douglass. He had been born a slave. He had gotten his freedom, and he became an abolitionist leader. He started his own newspaper called the North Star and published abolitionist material in that. And he opposed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. He hated it because it gave the slave catchers a chance to head up north to capture runaway slaves and take them back down south. So for the rest of his life, Frederick Douglass was, first off, he was an abolitionist who was opposed to slavery, and then later he became a civil rights leader who worked for equality for African Americans. So he's one of the very early, he was like the 1800s version of Martin Luther King Jr. He was the very first great black civil rights leader. Another important African American by the name of Harriet Tubman, a little lady who had been a slave. She had run away and escaped, and she could have lived up north, but she decided to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, what the Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses that slaves could go to on their way to Canada, because they had to escape all the way to Canada so that they weren't captured by slave catchers up north. So they had to make it all the way to Canada. And conductors were people that were operated safe houses and also led the slaves out of the South. Well, she's one of the people who led the slaves out of the South. She risked her own life. She actually would go down south and pretend she was a slave, and then she would round up slaves and help them escape to the north. And she did that over and over and over again. Incredible lady. She carried a pistol. And if they weren't willing to go, if the slaves weren't willing to go, she'd point the pistol at them. She said, "You can either go or you can die right here because I'm taking you." And so she was a tough old lady. Not old, she was young. Tough lady. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a white abolitionist, and she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in it, she portrayed the very worst possible scenarios for slavery. And it became a bestseller. It was one of the greatest books ever written in American history. It became an international bestseller, and it changed a lot of people's minds about the institution of slavery. She was a little tiny lady, and when Abraham Lincoln met her, he said, "So you're the little lady who started this big war," and he was talking about the Civil War. Southerners hated the book. They said it was full of lies, but it did have the impact that she wanted, that millions of Northerners realized that slavery was evil and that it was bad and it was brutal. In 1857, a slave by the name of Dred Scott sued in court for his freedom. His owner had taken him into some free states and free territories. His owner had been in the military. And so Dred Scott, when his owner died, Dred Scott sued for his freedom. He said, "Look, I was in those free territories, and when I was, there was no slavery allowed there, so I was automatically should have been given my freedom." Well, he sued in Missouri court, then it went to federal court, and it worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's probably the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made in American history. They ruled that, first off, he shouldn't have been allowed to sue in court because he wasn't a citizen, he was a slave. He was property, not a human being. Number two, no people of African descent could ever be American citizens. And then they expanded it, and they said slaveholders should be allowed to take their property, in other words, slaves, anywhere they wanted to out in the Western territories. So they could take their slaves to Utah or Nebraska or Kansas or anywhere they wanted to, that it was unconstitutional to prevent them from taking their property while allowing Northerners to take all of their property out west. At any rate, there was a horrible decision, and it split the country. It was just awful. Dred Scott eventually did get his freedom, so there is a happy ending to the story. And it's going to set up a situation in Kansas that's going to lead to what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, one thing I don't like about Chapter 11 is they throw in, at the end of the chapter, Native Americans and Mexican Americans, their civil rights problems. I wish they had just stuck with the slavery issue. But bottom line is, Native Americans, obviously, their land was under assault, as white settlers moved west. Native Americans had their land taken from them. Most of the time, the United States government tried to buy the land, purchase the land, and have the natives sign a treaty. And the Native Americans assumed that the treaty was going to last forever, but a few years later, the government would go back and say, sorry, we need some more of your land, sell it to us, and we'll sign a new treaty. And, of course, eventually it led to bloodshed. The Indian Wars from the 1850s through the 1870s are evidence of that, which you'll find out more next year about those. Native Americans eventually were sent to reservations, which were hunks of land, big pieces of land usually, where they had to stay on the reservation. They had to live there, and the government provided them with their food and clothing and blankets and all that sort of stuff. And usually it was almost starvation rations. It was really bad. The Cheyenne broke out of their reservation, and the government chased them around for a while. And eventually the Cheyenne were forced onto another reservation further north. Anyhow, so that's a little bit about that. Mexican Americans, the problem they faced in all this territory after the Mexican War, the Mexican Cession in Texas and so forth, was the Mexican people who lived there, the Spanish people who lived there, they had lived there, some of them, for 150, 200 years, but they didn't have any deeds, which is legal documents, to their land. Everybody knew this is their land. That's just the way that Mexico and the Spanish government did it. And so as a result, they had no paperwork. So when white settlers, when it became part of the United States, the laws changed. They had to have deeds to the land, and they didn't have any. So white settlers came, and the courts forced the Mexicans and Spaniards off of the land that their families had owned for literally, a couple of hundred years sometimes. Another problem was that the tax code changed. Initially under Mexico, your tax was based on your crop. So if you had a good crop, you paid a higher tax. If you had a poor crop, you paid a very, very low tax. In the United States government, and the laws were that you paid for the value of the land, the size of the land. So some of these ranches and farms were pretty big. So some of these Mexican people who had owned this land for a long time, they would have poor crops or run into trouble times, and they didn't have money to pay off their taxes. So the government would foreclose. The term is foreclose, which means they would seize the land from the Mexicans, and then the Mexicans would become landless. The new Mexican American citizens would become landless. And obviously the courts were usually stacked against them. In New Mexico, there were enough wealthy Mexican Americans that they were able to control a little bit of it and try to stop it in certain instances. But throughout most of the West, many of the Mexicans lost their land. Of course, many did get to keep their land as well in California and elsewhere, but the new governments, the federal government and the state and territorial governments, they stacked the decks against the Mexicans and did everything in their power to take the land away from the Mexicans and give it to white settlers, with some limited success. So African Americans suffered from slavery. Mexican Americans suffered from prejudice and discrimination. Native Americans suffered from the loss of land, ultimately the loss of their culture. It was a bad situation. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is more or less a summary of the rest of Chapter 11. I did post a study guide video on YouTube. Hopefully you have that. Please use that to fill out your study guide for our test. We'll have the test sometime next week. I haven't decided when exactly. So you guys have a good weekend, and hopefully you stay healthy. So have a good one. Bye.